Sometimes I wonder at what exact moment my life took this strange turn. Maybe it was when I noticed that my heart no longer beat the same for the same person, or when my hands no longer caressed the same skin. Now I try to remember how it all began. And the truth is that it all started with a simple phone call. I was stuck in traffic. Outside, the noise of the cars and an almost muted radio were my only company. I had a strange feeling of emptiness, as if I sensed that something was about to happen. And so it was. The phone rang with a strange insistence. "Dad is not well. Can you stop by his house?" "I'll arrive later," my husband said in such a distant tone. I hung up the phone, but my mind was left confused. Something inside me tensed up. And then I received a second message. This time it was his father, my father-in-law. I could barely understand his words among his gasps, but I was able to hear clearly. "Lorena, help me." I parked the car on the side of the street. My heart was pounding. And when I arrived at his door, I found it half open. Upon entering, I saw him on the floor, breathing with difficulty and with an expression that mixed pain and resignation. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice trembling with worry. I tried to help him get up, but I didn't have enough strength, and he could barely mumble, "Thank you." While I tried to regain my composure, I realized that it wasn't the first time I'd seen him so defenseless. But this time felt different. There was an air of urgency that covered everything. And there was also something I didn't understand yet, something that gave me goosebumps. I helped him lie on the couch, and in doing so, our gazes crossed. For an instant that felt eternal, I perceived something in his eyes that I couldn't decipher, but that gave me a sense of unease that didn't disappear even when I returned home that night. That simple call for help became the beginning of something that would change my life forever. The visits to my father-in-law's house became more and more frequent. Every afternoon after my job, I arrived at that old home, which over the passing days, I began to feel almost like a second home. Often I would find him seated in his armchair with the television on, although he didn't seem to really pay attention to it. There was something in the atmosphere of that place, a calm that clashed head-on with the chaos of my daily life. One afternoon, after finishing preparing his dinner, I headed to the door to leave. I'd already started to say goodbye when he called me from his armchair. "Lorena." His voice sounded gentle, almost shy. "Thank you for everything you do for me. I don't know what I would do without you." I stopped in my tracks. There was something in his tone that made me come closer again. I sat by his side, thinking that he simply wanted to thank me once more, but his look was different, as if he wished to say something else. Suddenly, in a gesture I wasn't expecting, he took my hand, something he had never done before, and said, "Your husband is a very lucky man." And in a delicate move, he leaned toward me. I felt the warmth of his face near mine, and before I could react, his lips brushed against mine. It happened so fast that I pushed him away immediately, totally bewildered. "No, we shouldn't," was all I managed to stammer without finding the right words. His gaze showed as much regret as it did desire. I left the house almost running, unable to understand what had just happened. After that incident, my mind wouldn't stop spinning. I kept telling myself that it had all been a misunderstanding, a moment of weakness. But something had changed. Visiting my father-in-law's house was no longer the same. Every time I arrived, I felt a tension in the air, something like an invisible barrier that neither of us wanted to cross. Meanwhile, in my own home, things continued to fall apart little by little. My husband was more absent than ever, focused on his work and his problems. The few times we coincided in the same place, the conversations were short, almost routine. "How's my father?" he would ask, without taking his eyes off his phone screen or his computer. "Better, it seems like he's recovering," I'd reply, though deep inside I knew I wasn't just talking about his physical health. As the days went by, the time I spent with my father-in-law no longer felt like a mere obligation. It became a refuge, a space where I felt valued. One night, I dared to talk about the silence that was arising between my husband and me. "Have you noticed that we barely talk? It seems like we live separate lives, as if we're no longer a couple." My voice sounded more desperate than I expected. He looked up, surprised, but responded coldly. "I've been very busy, Lorena. I don't have time for these things right now." And he went back to his screen, completely ignoring me. Those words hurt me like a blow. It wasn't just what he said, but also how he looked at me. with an indifference that broke my heart. I realized we had lost something important in our marriage and that I had no idea how to get it back. On the other hand, at my father-in-law's house, although the environment was charged with many emotions and a certain tension, at least there was a connection. He looked at me in a way that made me feel desired, something I hadn't felt with my husband for far too long. This confused me even more because I knew I was getting into a dangerous game. However, each time I saw my husband so focused on his own life and so oblivious to what was happening in ours, I felt lonelier. And in that loneliness, I found a kind of relief in the moments I spent in that old and dusty house, where time seemed to stand still and what was right and wrong mixed without distinction. One afternoon, upon arriving at my father-in-law's house, I saw him with a toolbox, something I had never witnessed in all the time I'd been looking after him. "What are you doing?" I asked with a smile, surprised to see him so active. "I thought about fixing some things around here. This place needs it. Besides, I want to thank you somehow for everything you do for me," he said in a tone more cheerful than usual. I didn't know what to reply. Seeing him so upbeat gave me back a little bit of that normalcy I'd been missing lately. I offered to help him, and we started moving old, dusty furniture that had been unused for years. After a while, we were choosing the paint color for one of the rooms. He seemed very interested in every detail, as if he wanted to cling to this small renovation as a symbol of something deeper. While we were painting one of the walls, he asked me, "Have you realized all that you've done for me, Lorena? Without you, I don't know how I would have gone on. You're my only company." His comment squeezed my heart, not only because of what he said, but because of the sincerity he conveyed. I tried to change the subject, but he insisted, "No, really. What you and I have is special. You know it, right?" I noticed my heart beating faster. We shouldn't talk about that," I replied, wanting to downplay it. "But you know it," he insisted, looking at me intently. "You know this is more than just a father-in-law and daughter-in-law relationship. We've been through a lot together." His words stayed in my mind as we kept painting in silence. It was as if each brushstroke created a new layer of tension. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't walk away leaving the wall half painted. Somehow that painting project was my excuse to stay. When we finally finished, it was already late and I got ready to leave. He walked me to the door, and just before I turned the doorknob, he brushed my hand with his. It was a soft gesture, almost imperceptible, that paralyzed me for a second. It wasn't like the previous time. It wasn't an impulsive outburst. That touch felt more intimate, more calculated. "Lorena," he murmured. The way he said my name stopped me. I tried to say, "We really shouldn't," but I didn't finish the sentence. There were no words to stop what I felt. A few days passed before I returned to my father-in-law's house. I knew I was treading on dangerous ground, but something pushed me back there again and again. I kept telling myself it was only to finish the renovation, that nothing had changed. But inside, I knew that wasn't true. That afternoon, the atmosphere in the house felt different. The air was thick, but not because of the heat or dust, but because of an invisible tension. My father-in-law was sitting in the dining room, looking at some old photos. He greeted me with a smile, but in his eyes, I could see that we both knew what was about to happen. "Are you going to keep painting?" he asked with apparent calmness, though his gaze told me something deeper. "Yes, I want to finish the living room wall," I replied, trying to sound carefree. As we walked to the living room, the silence between us grew bigger. I knew that silence was more than just awkwardness. It was the open door to what was about to happen. We started painting the living room, each one at a different end, without talking for a good while. Once in a while, our arms brushed against each other when moving furniture, but we avoided making comments. The silence was deafening. Then, once we had made good progress, I paused. He did the same, and suddenly we found ourselves face to face without saying a word. "Lorena," he began softly. I turned toward him, but I couldn't hold his gaze for long. I knew what he was going to say. "You know we can't go on pretending," he continued, taking a step toward me. "Please don't say anything," I murmured, knowing my plea didn't have enough strength. Inside, I was torn between what I should do and what I had started to feel unintentionally. He moved a little closer, and before I could process it, he was next to me. We didn't speak or offer explanations. What happened was as unexpected as it was inevitable. He kissed me slowly, and this time it wasn't like the first. It wasn't a desperate act, but an instant that seemed to stop time. a kiss that needed no long explanations, because we both understood we had crossed a point of no return. I pulled away immediately, my hands trembling, but I said nothing. The silence around us had changed. It was now filled with something we couldn't, nor did we want to, undo. We stayed motionless, looking at each other with the understanding that everything was different from that moment on. Without saying more, I gathered my things and left, knowing that from that day on, I wouldn't be the same. After that, my life became full of awkward silences and confusing thoughts. I knew I had made a mistake, and that what happened should never have happened. I tried to convince myself I could ignore it, leave it behind, but it was impossible. All my thoughts returned to that moment in the living room, to that kiss that had changed everything. I wanted to go on with my routine, pretending nothing had happened, but the guilt weighed on me more and more. I kept visiting my father-in-law's house, although now the tension was even greater. Neither of us talked about what had happened, as if we had unconsciously agreed to leave that in the past. Of course, it was useless, because every look and every word were loaded with what we didn't say. One day, I found him in the kitchen making coffee. His face looked calmer than usual, as if he had made peace with the situation. I, on the other hand, felt my stomach turn every time I saw him. "Coffee?" he offered, smiling, as if everything was still the same. "Yes, thanks," I replied, making a huge effort to act normal. We sat at the table, each of us with our cup in hand. The silence felt heavy. Each sip of coffee seemed endless. I couldn't look him in the eye, not after what happened. However, something inside me sought his gaze, his approval, even his forgiveness. "Lorena," he said at last, breaking the silence, "we can't go on like this." His voice was gentle but firm. "I know. This is too complicated, but I don't know how to talk about what happened," I confessed, unable to hide my confusion. "I don't either," he said, staring at his cup, as if the answer were in it. "But pretending nothing happened doesn't do us any good. Also, what happened wasn't a mistake." Those words hit me. For me, I saw everything as a huge mistake, but part of me knew he had a point. There was something between us that had been growing for a long time. It wasn't just the kiss. It was all we felt and ignored until that moment. "It's not right," I said, my voice trembling, raising my eyes and finally holding his gaze for what seemed like an eternity. "We can't do this to my husband. We can't go down this path." But he didn't seem convinced. "I know, but I can't deny what I feel. And I know you can't either." Silence returned, both of us aware that this was a dead end. Sooner or later, everything would be found out, and the consequences would be terrible, but at that moment, neither of us was ready to make a decision. The day I feared so much finally arrived. After weeks living in an atmosphere full of tension, trying to pretend that everything was going to be fine, my husband began to notice the changes. He had never been very observant about the details of our relationship, but this time something told him things weren't right. Perhaps because of my constant absences. Perhaps because of my evasive answers whenever he asked me something. One night, when I arrived home after a long visit to his father's house, I found him sitting on the couch, holding the phone and looking straight at me. The TV was on, but he wasn't paying attention to it. I stood still at the door, surprised to see him there, since he usually stayed at work until late. Something in his look gave me chills. "Lorena," he said calmly, but with something in his tone that I couldn't figure out. "Can we talk?" I felt a knot in my stomach. I knew that everything I had been trying to avoid was about to explode. I slowly walked closer, not knowing what to do or say. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "Something's wrong," he answered bluntly. "Lately, you're distant. You're not the same. And I'm not stupid. I know something is going on." His words made me feel like the ground was opening beneath my feet. I tried to think of an excuse, but nothing came to mind. There was no way to hide the truth. "What are you talking about?" I tried to dodge the question, even though I knew it was pointless because he knew me too well. "Are you seeing someone else?" he asked with a pain in his voice that broke my soul. I couldn't answer right away. I didn't know how to react. Part of me wanted to deny it, pretend it was all a misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew he wouldn't believe me anymore. His trust in me was broken. "It's complicated," I mumbled. "I guess so," he said, lowering his gaze. "I just wanted to hear it from you, to give you the chance to be honest." My eyes filled with tears. I knew that in that moment, everything would collapse, that there was no going back. I didn't plan it. I tried to explain. I never wanted it to happen, but it happened. But it happened, he repeated for me. He stood up from the couch and went over by the window, turning his back to me. The silence that followed was unbearable. I felt like nothing I could say would console him. Is it with my father? He asked suddenly. His voice was so calm that I could barely believe what I was hearing. My heart dropped. How could he possibly know? I didn't answer, but my silence confirmed his suspicions. For a while now, I sensed something strange. He went on, but I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't imagine you would do something like this, neither you nor him. Tears rolled down my face. I could barely whisper, I'm sorry. He closed his eyes, taking a moment to process it all. I don't know how we got here, Lorena. I don't know at what point everything broke. But there's no fixing this, is there? I don't know, I admitted, feeling my heart shatter. I also couldn't understand how we had reached this extreme, but I felt he was right. There was no going back. I'm going to stay at a friend's place for a while, he finally said. I need space to think. I don't know what I'll do next, but I can't stay here. I watched him pack his things in silence. At that moment, I realized I'd lost everything. Our home, our life together was falling apart before my eyes, and there was no way to fix it. When he closed the door, I was left alone in a house full of silence, aware that my life would never be the same again. That's when I thought, I have to go to my father-in-law's house. When I went in, he was sitting in the same armchair where it all began. There were no smiles or friendly gestures, only tired looks filled with resignation. I approached carefully, feeling the weight of our actions fall on me. I knew this would be the last time. Lorena, he began in a dull voice, we can't go on like this. I know, I answered without hesitation. This has to end. We've gone too far. We stayed quiet for a moment. I felt as if every word we didn't say became another wall between us. In the end, he spoke, I'm sorry for everything. I never wanted things to go this far. His apology hurt me. Yes, he made the first move, but I followed him. There were no innocents here. We both had done something that should never have happened. It wasn't just you, I said barely audibly. I allowed it too. We both crossed the line. His eyes full of remorse met mine. For a second, everything seemed to calm down, but it was just that, a brief blink. My son. He knows, doesn't he? He asked at last, though it seemed he already knew. His voice carried the guilt of a father who has betrayed himself. I understood that fact pained him more than anything else. His relationship with his son was destroyed, and there was no way to fix it. I think it's best we don't see each other anymore, I said, my heart in my hand. It's not just about what happened, it's that this has no way out. Maybe you're right, he murmured without looking at me, though I noticed a tension in his voice. But there's something I still haven't told you. My stomach tightened instantly. Something in his tone alerted me. What is it? I asked, almost not wanting to hear the answer. He inhaled slowly, as if summoning courage. Your husband, he knows more than you think. It wasn't a coincidence that everything came to light. A chill ran through me. What was he talking about? What do you mean? I managed to ask. He knew about it a long time ago. And what's worse, he told me before you even suspected. His words hung in the air, and my mind couldn't process them. How could my husband have known from the start? Why hadn't he confronted me directly? Why did he let me continue? Why didn't you tell me? I whispered, feeling betrayed all over again. Because I thought that if I told you, you'd pull away. I believed what we had wouldn't survive if you knew he was playing it his way. My whole world crumbled again. My husband had known everything from the beginning, and he didn't stop it for reasons I couldn't understand. But why? I asked, feeling a void in my chest. Why would he do something like that? He stood up, his gaze fixed on mine, but there were no clear answers in his eyes, only more questions. That's something you'll have to figure out yourself, was the last thing he said to me. I left that house with more doubts than certainties. The late afternoon wind hit me and made me feel like nothing would ever be the same again. My husband had allowed everything, and I didn't understand why. And as I walked away, I knew for sure that my life, as I knew it, was over. This is how my story ends, marked by a forbidden love, a betrayal that destroyed my marriage, and a revelation that broke my soul. I have walked a path full of guilt, tears, and remorse. I thank Unforgettable Love Stories for taking in my testimony and giving me the opportunity to share these scars that still hurt. Thank you for listening to me and for allowing me to confess the truth of what I lived.